The day before my wedding, my fiancé, James Thornton's adopted sister, Georgia Thornton, killed my parents in a drunk driving accident under the pretext of being intoxicated. James not only didn't blame Georgia, but even invited her to be my bridesmaid. Without receiving a fair judgment, I cast a scene at the wedding, furiously demanding Georgia pay for her crimes. But the guests mocked me as a crazy woman. James held me as I broke down and solemnly promised Yvonne, "Please marry me. I will help you get justice." I agreed. James appeared to righteously send Georgia to prison, telling me she was sentenced to 5 years, and I believed him. But in the 4th year of our marriage, while pregnant, I accidentally overheard his true thoughts. Good thing I married Yvonne for that letter of forgiveness. Otherwise, how could George have graduated smoothly from her top university master's program? Seeing her successfully enter the research institute, I feel gratified as her brother. So James's idea of justice for me was letting a murderer go free. And she even earned a graduate degree. In comparison, my parents' lives weren't as important as James's adopted sister's future. I left him resolutely. This time I would avenge my parents with my own hands. I stood outside the study, consumed by overwhelming rage. I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. In the study, James was watching Georgia's video blog from her overseas studies, with regret yet satisfaction on his tablet. 4 years have passed, and Georgia now has a bright future ahead of her. James paused, looking at our wedding photo on the desk, his expression darkening. Yvonne is pregnant now, so consider it as if I've compensated her with another life. We're even for what happened back then. What's even now? How could he possibly think a life could be exchanged for another? I suddenly tightened my hand on my abdomen, feeling a stabbing pain in my heart. My parents lost their lives. Yet, he casually said, we were even remembering the photos James had given me 3 years ago of him personally sending Georgia to prison. I felt cold all over, as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water over me. At that moment, James's phone vibrated twice. It was a document from his assistant. Through James's inner voice, I clearly heard their conversation. "Mr. Thornton, news about Ms. Georgia Thornton seems to have leaked. Several shareholders know about this matter, and they now want to hold a shareholders meeting to remove you from your position. Anyway, Ms. Georgia Thornton is far away overseas. You can still distance yourself from her in time." James frowned and refused without hesitation. Distance myself? Georgia is my sister. As long as she's happy and safe, I'd willingly give up my position as CEO of the Thornton Group, or even go to prison in her place. His assistant said nothing more. After pondering for a moment, James added, "Have someone keep a close eye on Yvonne. Don't let her know anything about this matter." He put down his phone, pinched the bridge of his nose, and said, "Only half a month left. Once George's nominal prison term is over, it will be too late for Yvonne to pursue further legal action." With just a few casual sentences, he had revealed all the cruel truth. It turned out my parents, lying in the cemetery, still hadn't seen their killer brought to justice. I thought Georgia was in prison, atoning for her sins, but instead she had been enjoying herself overseas for 4 whole years. As footsteps sounded, I instinctively hid in the dark bathroom nearby. The moment I confirmed he was going downstairs, I seemed to run out of strength and collapsed onto the floor. Thinking of my parents in the cemetery, unable to rest in peace, I felt intense regret and an uncontrollable wave of nausea. In an instant, my stomach churned and my throat burned as the sound of vomiting echoed in the small bathroom. I held onto the toilet, my entire body trembling. My tears. Tears also flowed uncontrollably. Tears welled up in my eyes uncontrollably. With a snap, the bathroom light was turned on. "Vonnie, why are you throwing up again?" James embraced me from behind, worriedly handing me a glass of water to rinse my mouth. "Is the baby making you feel unwell again?" I didn't argue, suppressing the nausea and forcing my voice to sound steady. "It's nothing. I'm just emotionally unstable during pregnancy." "Bonnie, I know this is difficult," he said with a smile, comforting me while affectionately stroking my hair. Then James changed the subject, saying, "By the way, I have a business trip next week." I felt a wave of panic and asked, "Where are you going?" "Harrington," James said. "I'm going to visit Georgia while I froze, my fingers trembling slightly. This was the first time in 4 years that James had mentioned Georgia in front of me. "Vanny, you don't mind, do you?" he asked gently. "Georgia has been in prison for 4 years now. After all, I'm still her brother, so I should go see her." I turned to look at him, seeing the expectation in his eyes, and felt another wave of nausea. James had deceived me for 3 whole years, using tenderness as a weapon and love as bait. Of course not. I forced a smile and said, "Go ahead, Vonnie." "You've become so much more reasonable," he said with satisfaction. "You used to always be so about Georgia." "It's all in the past," I interrupted James. "Besides, hasn't she already been punished by the law?" James nodded and smiled, placing a kiss on my forehead. "Thank you for understanding, wife." I lowered my head, not letting him see the tears glistening in my eyes. I thought, he's right. I should understand him. I should try to understand how much he loves Georgia, even to the point of willingly sacrificing his own happiness for the rest of his life. At midnight, James made an excuse about having an international conference call. Not wanting to disturb my rest, he went to the study alone. I was left by myself in the bedroom. In the silent room, my ears were filled with noisy sounds, all voices about James's inner thoughts. Georgia, have you been staying up late working on your thesis this week? How are you feeling? Do you have enough money in your bank account? I glanced up at the calendar, belated realizing it was Thursday. Since the day I married James, I knew he had a regular international conference call every Thursday night. I had always wondered why he insisted on having a routine meeting at midnight, not even waiting for the 7 or 8 hour time difference. It turned out it was related to Georgia. I could only laugh at myself. On the other end of the call, Georgia's personal butler had begun reporting on her situation in meticulous detail. We have updated Ms. Georgia Thornton's entire set of haute couture clothing for the season. We've made long-term VIP reservations at the restaurant she's been favoring recently. The 2 pieces of jewelry worth millions of dollars that you ordered last month have been delivered. Ms. Georgia Thornton says she loves them. Everything about Georgia's daily life was taken care of with the utmost attention. I sat numbly on the bed, the light from my phone screen reflecting on my pale face. For over 1,000 days and nights, my enemy had been living like this. Suddenly, the butler's words brought me back to reality. Mr. Thornton, we've already booked the same room and attractions that Ms. Georgia Thornton stayed at during her vacation in Mercado 6 months ago. When do you plan to fly over? I widened my eyes, using trembling hands to check Georgia and James's Instagram updates. Sure enough, James would always personally visit the places Georgia had been to. 6 months later, James walked the path she had walked, felt the evening breeze. He used almost everything he had to remember Georgia. James's inner voice suddenly became tender, filled with undisguised, deep affection. Soon I won't need to fly over anymore. She'll be able to come back and see me soon. I listened in silence, recalling how in the past years, whenever I suggested going on vacation, James always refused, claiming we shouldn't be too high profile. It wasn't that we couldn't be too high profile. It was that he didn't want Georgia to feel sad when she saw us. The meeting in the study continued, but I couldn't listen anymore. I silently made an appointment with the gynecologist for the next day, stroking my slightly swollen belly. My eyes grew dim. Let everything end here. Whether it was the child in my womb or this marriage full of schemes, everything should. I stayed up all night until dawn. After washing up and coming downstairs, I found James already sitting at the dining table. Seeing me, he picked up his phone and asked Yvonne, "Why did the hospital send me an appointment reminder text? Are you feeling unwell?" I froze, suddenly remembering that when I first became pregnant, I had linked his phone number in the hospital system. "It's nothing," I quietly explained. "I missed my last prenatal checkup, so I need to go today. It's just a small examination. I can handle it myself. You can go to work without worrying." He nodded and thoughtfully helped me sit down. "Honey, thank you for understanding. I've booked a maternity photo shoot for you in the Greek Aegean Sea in 2 weeks, as my pregnancy gift to you was exactly when Georgia would be returning to the country." Perhaps I was too disappointed in James, which is why I was unusually calm this time. I understood he was just worried I might interfere with his reunion with Georgia, who was about to return. James quickly finished breakfast and dropped me off at the hospital on his way. When we parted, he gently kissed me, looking affectionate. "Take care of yourself and the baby. See you tonight." I nodded silently and walked into the hospital. Then, without hesitation, I told the doctor, "I don't want this baby anymore." Holding the surgery notice, I stood at the entrance of the operating room, unconsciously touching my belly. The baby in my womb seemed to sense something moving slightly. It was like a little fish blowing bubbles, completely unaware of the dangers outside world. Just then, my phone vibrated twice. James had sent a message asking about my well-being as usual. After staring at the cold words on the notice for a long time, I typed on my phone, "James, will you love our baby?" "James?" "Of course." The second after the message appeared, I heard another voice. "As long as our child is born safely, Yvonne might not pursue what happened back then. One child is all I need to exchange for George's return. Of course I like it." These were all James's inner thoughts. The child in my belly seemed to hear these words, too. Gently twisting its body, I reflexively clutched my clothes. In my confused mind, flashed the undisguised joy on James's face the day I got pregnant. "You're pregnant, Yvonne? Are you saying we're going to have a baby?" So that day, when I took James's hand and gently touched my belly, he was inwardly confessing his disloyalty to Georgia, using the child to control and manipulate me. He had never once purely looked forward to this child that belonged to us. The broadcast at the operating room entrance called my name. With an almost desperate smile, I gritted my teeth, swallowed all my tears, and stepped into the operating room without hesitation. After the surgery, the coldness of the instruments replaced the baby in my belly. Clutching my agonizingly painful abdomen, I took a taxi directly to the law firm. When I inquired about the settlement agreement James had signed on my behalf, the lawyer looked very uncomfortable. "Ms. Stewart, I'm sorry. Mr. Thornton did indeed exploit a legal loophole back then, but time is pressing now. Even if we file for prosecution immediately, I'm afraid it's already too late. The lawyer pushed up the glasses on his nose, his tone full of resignation. I nodded, not asking further, only requesting him to print 2 copies of a standard divorce agreement for me regarding property division. Do you have any requests? The lawyer asked routinely. I shook my head and calmly said, as for our house, car, and those properties under his name, I don't need any of them. They felt tainted to me. As I was about to take a taxi to the Thornton Group with the few thin pages of the agreement, I suddenly heard James's inner voice in my ears. Georgia, why did you suddenly return to the country alone? I stood frozen in place, but the conversation in my ears continued. You came back without telling me, even though your prosecution period hasn't expired yet. What's wrong? Do you miss me that much? You couldn't even wait for the last 2 weeks. I assume you're like a goldfish and have forgotten how Yvonne went crazy 4 years ago. Right? I wondered. Was I really acting crazy before? I thought. Had I been acting crazy before? Suddenly something occurred to me and pain washed over my entire body. I sat in the dimly lit taxi outside the Thornton Group building, the shredded divorce agreement clutched in my trembling hands. Every step of the day had carved deeper into my soul. Memories of a wedding ruined by betrayal, the haunting echo of James's inner voice, and the sickening realization that my entire life had been manipulated for someone else's gain. Now, as I made my way to the law firm, the pain in my body mirrored the agony in my heart. It wasn't just the physical pain from the surgery or the numbing cold of the operating room that tormented me now. It was the weight of a lifetime of lies and the knowledge that the man I once trusted had traded my family's memory for a future built on the success of his adopted sister, Georgia. I remembered the wedding day all too well, the furious outburst demanding justice, the guests laughing at my tears, and the broken promise that James had made as he held me in his arms. Now, as I replayed every bitter word and every whispered secret from that fateful day, I realized that my journey was far from over. My decision to leave him wasn't born solely of anger. It was born of a fierce need to reclaim my identity and avenge the loss of my parents. I had chosen to sever all ties with the Thornton name and with the man who had used my grief as a bargaining chip. Inside the taxi, I stared out at the rain-soaked streets. The city, with its neon reflections and relentless pace, felt indifferent to my suffering. I wondered if the truth would ever set me free, or if I was doomed to carry the weight of injustice forever. My mind drifted back to that horrifying moment in the study. James, alone with his tablet, watching Georgia's video blog with a look of twisted satisfaction. I had hidden in the bathroom, my body convulsing with nausea as his true thoughts spilled out like poison. His cold calculation, the way he compared the loss of my parents to the compensation he claimed for Yvonne's pregnancy, had ignited something dark inside me. That night, as I lay in the darkness with tears streaming down my face, I vowed that I would no longer be a pawn in his cruel game. In the silent hours of the morning, with the memory of my parents' unavenged deaths burning in my heart, I made the decision. I would fight back. I would gather every scrap of evidence, every whispered lie, and expose James Thornton for the manipulative tyrant he was. I would ensure that Georgia's freedom, so casually celebrated, would come at the cost of his soul. But first, I had to navigate the immediate chaos. With a heavy heart, I had agreed to the divorce settlement James had orchestrated. Every asset, every property, even the name that once bound me to our shattered past, I would renounce. I dialed the number for the law firm with a voice that trembled yet held a spark of determination. It was time to sever the final ties to this life of deceit. Arriving at the law firm, I could feel the cold resolve solidifying inside me. The lawyer, Mr. Stewart, had already processed the documents, his eyes filled with a resigned pity as he confirmed the final terms. Ms. Yvonne, the divorce is now complete. All properties, assets, and rights are relinquished, he stated in a tone that made it clear he understood the gravity of the situation. I barely managed a nod before stepping out into the biting air. In that moment, I realized that the Thornton Group, the name, the empire, all of it was a symbol of everything that had wronged me. My parents had been denied justice, their lives overshadowed by the ambition and manipulations of James and his twisted devotion to Georgia. Now, armed with the finality of a signed divorce, I felt both a hollow loss and a budding determination. I remembered the day I overheard James's true thoughts, how he measured my worth against the success of his adopted sister. That day had fractured the last remnants of my trust. I recalled his inner voice speaking with such casual cruelty, comparing my parents' lives to a transaction, as if one could simply exchange one life for another. It was a revelation that pushed me over the edge. I couldn't let it go unanswered. In the quiet of the law firm's corridor, I made a silent promise to myself. I would expose every lie, every injustice that had been hidden under the guise of justice and family loyalty. I would find the evidence to bring down James Thornton and his empire. My parents deserved that much. I deserved that much. As I left the building, a chill wind carried whispers of the past, snatches of conversations, memories of a happier time that now felt like a cruel joke. I looked at my phone, where a message from James's assistant still lingered in my mind, reminding me that his next move was scheduled for a business trip to see Georgia. That final, insidious twist of fate, the fact that he would soon be celebrating his adopted sister's triumphant return while my heart still ached, stung deeply. I vowed to use every ounce of my remaining strength, even as the pain in my body reminded me of the cost of this struggle. I would not be silenced by grief or manipulated by lies. I would be the avenger my parents deserved and the champion of my own shattered future. In the weeks following my finalization of the divorce, I plunged into a solitary crusade for truth. Every night, as the city's neon lights flickered in the distance, I pored over every scrap of evidence I'd accumulated. Fragments of overheard conversations, documents salvaged from secret folders, and even the damning snippets of James's inner voice I'd managed to record on my phone. I knew that exposing James Thornton's treachery wasn't just about avenging my parents' memory, it was about dismantling the empire built on deception. I began with the corporate records. Under the guise of revisiting old financial statements for my own peace of mind, I returned to the archives of the Thornton Group. Hidden deep within the folders were discrepancies, irregularities in transactions, payments made to shell companies, and mysterious entries that traced back to none other than Georgia Thornton. The records painted a damning picture. While James had publicly championed Georgia's punishment in court behind closed doors, he had secretly been funneling resources to ensure her continued success overseas. One rainy evening, I met with an old friend from my parents' past, an investigative journalist named Marcus Hayes, whose reputation for unearthing corporate scandals was unmatched. In a small, discreet cafe over steaming cups of bitter coffee, I laid out my findings. "Yvonne," Marcus said, his voice low and earnest, "this isn't just about personal betrayal. Look at these figures. Money diverted, falsified accounts, and loopholes that clearly favor one person over the memory of your parents. James's justice is a sham, a cover-up that's costing innocent lives." His eyes flickered with determination. "We need to expose this publicly, hold him accountable not only for his personal duplicity, but for the corporate malfeasance that's fueling his entire empire." As Marcus promised to dig deeper and verify the evidence with his contacts in the financial world, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps I wasn't alone in this battle. The seed of a hidden war had been planted, and soon allies began to emerge from the shadows. Over the following days, I discreetly reached out to those who had once worked for the Thornton Group, as well as members of victims' rights organizations who had been wronged by corporate greed. One name kept resurfacing among the whispers: a former executive, Eleanor Ellie Reyes, who had resigned under mysterious circumstances after confronting the unethical practices of the company. Meeting in a nondescript office on the outskirts of the city, Ellie revealed secrets that confirmed my worst suspicions. "I left Thornton Group because I saw the rot from within," she confided, her eyes steely with resolve. "They used family ties as a smokescreen. While they paraded Georgia as a victim, they protected her with every corporate loophole imaginable. And James? He's been manipulating the system to his own benefit, while punishing those who truly deserve justice." Ellie handed me a thick envelope containing internal emails, memos, and even a recorded conversation between James and one of his board members. The audio clip was damning. James's voice, dripping with cold calculation, discussed the timing of Georgia's release from her legal sentence and the strategic moves needed to ensure that any legal action by Yvonne would be stifled by corporate maneuvering. "This is it," Ellie said. "With this, we can expose him for the fraudster he is. But be careful. Thornton Group's reach is vast, and if they sense you're onto them, they'll stop at nothing." Armed with this evidence and bolstered by the support of Marcus and Ellie, I set out to compile a comprehensive dossier, a file that would expose not only James's personal betrayal, but also the systemic corruption that allowed him to control everything from his company's boardroom to the fate of my parents' memory. Every day brought me closer to a showdown. The corporate shareholders were stirring. News of internal irregularities had begun to leak. I watched from the sidelines as murmurs of a potential vote to remove James from his position circulated among influential investors. His once unassailable authority was beginning to crumble. I could almost feel the final reckoning approaching. Yet amidst this whirlwind of corporate scandal, my personal torment persisted. Late at night, as I lay in the silence of my apartment, I'd replay James's callous words, the way he measured our lives in terms of numbers, comparing my parents' memory to the compensation provided by his adopted sister's success. The image of our wedding, now tainted by betrayal and the relentless pursuit of a twisted justice, haunted me. One evening, as I sat in my small study surrounded by stacks of documents and glowing screens, I received a message that sent a chill down my spine. It was from an unknown number, and the text read, "Tick-tock, Yvonne. The truth you seek is closer than you think." I stared at the message, heart pounding. Was this a warning, or perhaps an invitation? I couldn't tell, but one thing was clear. The game was reaching its climax, and there was no turning back now. With renewed determination, I forwarded the message to Marcus and Ellie. Their responses were immediate, a shared agreement that the final pieces were falling into place, and that we had a narrow window of opportunity before Thornton Group's loyalists would move to silence us. I spent the next few days in a feverish scramble, cross-referencing records, verifying phone call logs, and preparing the final version of the dossier. Every piece of evidence had to be airtight. This wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about dismantling a corrupt system built on lies. At last, the day arrived. A major shareholders meeting was scheduled, and unbeknownst to James, our evidence had been leaked to a trusted media outlet. As cameras and microphones gathered outside the Thornton Group's headquarters, headlines began to flash. Corporate scandal, Thornton Group's dark secrets exposed. The public was hungry for the truth. Inside the boardroom, as James Thornton attempted to maintain his composure, his phone buzzed incessantly with alerts and messages. His face, once composed and smug, began to pale. The once unshakable tycoon now looked visibly rattled. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he ordered his assistant to distance any mention of Georgia from public records to suppress the unfolding scandal. But it was too late. As the meeting descended into chaos, with angry shareholders, outraged employees, and media representatives demanding answers, James's carefully constructed facade crumbled before everyone's eyes. In a moment broadcast live, he was forced to address the allegations. His voice, once so authoritative, now trembled with uncertainty as he attempted to deny the damning evidence. The truth, however, was relentless. In that moment, I watched from afar, a mixture of sorrow and vindication swirling inside me. My parents' memory, once silenced by injustice, was now being avenged not with violence, but with truth. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, and through our collective efforts, we were about to force a reckoning that James Thornton could no longer escape. The shareholders' meeting was in full swing when the storm broke. In the grand boardroom of the Thornton Group headquarters, a room once dominated by James's imperious presence, the air was thick with tension. Amid the clamor of outraged investors and a swarm of reporters, every screen and microphone broadcast the unraveling scandal live. The evidence we had gathered was undeniable. Millions in misappropriated funds, falsified accounts, and covert transactions that pointed straight to James Thornton's personal machinations. James's composed facade crumbled under the weight of damning internal emails and recorded conversations. His voice, once so sure and commanding, now wavered as he attempted to deny every accusation. But each denial was swiftly contradicted by the undeniable financial records and testimonies of former employees. The public, once charmed by his image as a visionary tycoon, now turned its gaze with incredulity and scorn. I watched from a secure location, my heart pounding with a mix of vindication and sorrow. This was the moment I had fought for, the moment when the lies that had stolen my parents' justice and poisoned my life were finally laid bare. Every injustice, every cruel comparison that James had made between my parents and his adopted sister Georgia was now exposed for the world to see. In a moment of rare candor, an executive from the board stepped forward and declared, "It is clear that the Thornton Group has been manipulated by personal interests far removed from ethical business practices. We call for an immediate investigation into Mr. Thornton's actions." Gasps and murmurs filled the room as shareholders rallied, demanding accountability. The public outcry was swift and relentless. With the evidence now public, regulatory agencies and law enforcement mobilized to seize control of the situation. Within days, James Thornton's empire began to crumble. Major investors pulled out, and a federal investigation was launched into his corporate dealings. James, who had once declared that he would sacrifice everything for Georgia's success, even his position as CEO, now found himself isolated. His attempts to shield his adopted sister from repercussions backfired. Georgia's luxurious life overseas, carefully curated through every social media post and VIP reservation, became the centerpiece of a scandal that no one could ignore. As headlines blared the story of corporate fraud and personal betrayal, James's reputation disintegrated. In a televised press conference that was watched by millions, James tried to explain his actions, claiming that every decision had been made in the name of family loyalty. But his words rang hollow. The public saw only a man willing to trade justice for personal gain, a man who had let my parents' untimely deaths be reduced to a mere transaction. His pleas for understanding went unheeded as prosecutors moved swiftly to indict him on multiple charges. I learned later that in a last-ditch effort to salvage his crumbling legacy, James had tried to manipulate internal documents and even falsify further evidence. But with every new revelation, his defense fell apart. The very system he had once exploited turned against him. Amid the corporate chaos, I felt a profound personal reckoning taking place. For years, I had been forced to endure the manipulation, the twisted version of justice that James had imposed on our lives. I had been made to feel that my grief, the memory of my parents, was expendable, as if their lives could be offset by the promise of another bright future for Georgia. Now, as James's empire disintegrated and his personal life lay in ruins, I found a bittersweet sense of closure. I attended the final court hearings as a silent observer, watching as the judge condemned not only his corporate misdeeds, but his moral transgressions as well. Every gavel strike resonated like a tribute to the parents I had lost, and the injustice that had haunted my life for so long. One cold morning after the verdict was read and James was led away in handcuffs, I returned to the cemetery where my parents rested. The morning light was soft and mournful as I knelt by their graves, my hands trembling as I traced the etched letters on their headstones. I whispered an apology for the pain I had endured and a vow, a promise that I would honor their memory by never allowing injustice to go unchallenged. I left the cemetery with a heavy heart, but also with a renewed resolve. The battle had been long and bitter, but in its wake, I had found a way to reclaim my identity. I began working with victim support groups and advocacy organizations, using my story as a rallying cry for those who had been wronged by corporate and personal treachery alike. In the months that followed, while the legal and financial institutions dismantled the corrupt foundations of the Thornton Group, I embarked on a journey of self-reclamation. I reconnected with old friends who had once known me as more than just the wife of a tyrant, and I discovered a strength within myself that I had never known. I began writing a memoir, a raw, unfiltered account of my struggle, the loss of my parents, the betrayal by the man I once loved, and the journey toward justice. My words, steeped in grief and resilience, resonated with countless readers who saw in my story a mirror of their own hidden wounds and battles. At a small book launch held in a modest community center, I read aloud an excerpt from my memoir. The audience was silent, hanging on every word as I recounted the events that had shattered my world and ultimately led me to rebuild it. In that moment, I realized that my pain could serve a higher purpose, to ignite change and offer hope to those who had suffered in silence. Meanwhile, Georgia Thornton, whose life had been so meticulously managed by James, faded further into obscurity. The media, now fixated on the fall of the Thornton Empire, barely mentioned her name. In a twist of poetic justice, the woman who had been celebrated and shielded at the expense of truth was left to face the consequences of a system that valued power over accountability. Standing at the threshold of a new life, I looked back on the long, treacherous path I had walked, a path marked by betrayal, injustice, and heartache. The memories of my parents, the haunting presence of James Thornton's manipulation, and the cold indifference that had once defined my existence were all now part of my past. But I had emerged stronger, my spirit tempered like steel forged in fire. The legal battles were over, and the corporate scandal had reshaped an industry. James Thornton, once a symbol of unchecked ambition and moral decay, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. And while the wounds of the past would never fully heal, I learned to wear them as a testament to my resilience. I continue to work for justice, not just for myself, but for every voice that had been silenced by corruption and cruelty. In my memoir, I remind my readers that the darkest moments can give birth to the brightest dawns, that even when all seems lost, the truth has the power to set us free. As I walk toward a future built on truth, compassion, and the unwavering belief that no injustice can stand forever, I know that my parents' legacy lives on in every step I take. Their memory is my guide, and the scars they left behind are a map of where I have been, and a promise of where I will go. In that final, quiet moment, as the first rays of a new day broke through the horizon, I embraced the promise of renewal. My life, once entangled in a web of deceit and manipulation, had finally been reclaimed. And with every heartbeat, I vowed that no one would ever again be forced to pay the unbearable price of injustice.